50 minutes past midnight, February 7th, 1968. A Green Beret in an observation tower at Lang Vei looks west into the dark and sees the impossible. Soviet tanks, 11 of them, grinding through the wire of a special forces camp 4 miles from Kherson. He keys his radio. 4 words: tanks in the wire. Inside the perimeter, 24 Americans. Outside, 2 infantry battalions, sapper companies, and the first armored assault the North Vietnamese army would ever launch against U.S. ground troops. But the tanks were not the horror. The horror was carried on the shoulders of the infantry walking behind them. A 4-foot steel tube, a rocket the size of a wine bottle, a weapon costing less than a used hunting rifle that could punch a hole of incandescent copper through any vehicle the United States Army had brought to Vietnam. For the next 8 hours, the Americans inside Lang Vei would learn what it meant to be hunted by a weapon they could not see, could not hear in time, could not stop. This is the story of the RPG-7 and the men it killed. By the spring of 1967, every North Vietnamese infantry squad carried one. The Soviets called it Ruchnoy Protivotankovy Granatomyot, handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. The Vietnamese called it the B-41. The Americans, when they had time to call it anything, just called it the RPG, a reusable launcher. 37 inches of smoothbore steel, 7 kilograms unloaded, wrapped in wood to keep the gunner's hand from burning off. A grenade, 85 millimeters wide, point-impact fuse, a shape-charge warhead that, even in its most basic 1960s form, could burn through more than 10 inches of solid armor plate. A 2-man team, 1 gunner, 1 loader, hidden in a tree line. The math was simple, and the math was obscene. The launcher cost about $300, each rocket $40 to $80. A UH-1 Huey helicopter cost $250,000, an AH-1 Cobra gunship closer to $400,000, a CH-47 Chinook just under $1 million. The M113 armored personnel carrier, the workhorse that carried American infantry through every jungle in Vietnam, cost $22,000 and could not stop the rocket. A farmer in a bush, $1 million machine in the sky, a piece of math the Pentagon had not run. To fire, the gunner pulled the trigger. A gunpowder booster ejected the grenade from the tube at 380 feet per second. 10 yards out, clear of the gunner, the rocket sustainer ignited. The grenade accelerated to nearly 700 miles per hour, stabilized by small fins, trailing a thin gray-blue line of smoke. The fuse armed itself in flight. When it struck, a tank, a truck, a Huey door, a sandbag wall, a copper cone inside the warhead collapsed under the detonation. Hydrodynamic pressure turned solid metal into a jet moving at 6 miles per second. It did not explode like Hollywood. It punched. A pencil-thin tunnel of white-hot copper. And behind the copper, spall. Fragments of the vehicle's own armor, spraying inside the crew compartment at lethal velocity, igniting fuel, cooking ammunition. Survivors describe the sound in 2 parts. The whoosh of the rocket motor leaving the tree line, then the bam. At close range, under 100 yards, there was no gap between them. The whoosh and the bam were the same sound. A pilot at an LZ, a driver in an M113, a point man stepping into a clearing. None of them heard it in time. The first RPG-7s crossed into North Vietnam in 1966, carried down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in pieces, reassembled in the south. By the spring of '67, they were everywhere. January 15, 1968, near Dak To, the Central Highlands. A tank platoon from Company B, 1st Battalion, 69th Armor, 4th Infantry Division, moves up a forest road. Inside one of the M48 Pattons, Specialist 5 Dwight H. Johnson rides with men he has known for 2 years. The tree line opens up. 2 M48s take direct hits in the side armor, the angles American tankers had been told the Patton could shrug off. The shape-charged jets cut through 50 tons of steel as though it weren't there. Johnson's closest friends are inside one of those tanks. What he does next, climbing out of his own disabled vehicle, charging NVA positions with a submachine gun and a pistol, refusing every order to stop, will earn him the Medal of Honor. But the lesson of Dak To was simpler than the citation. The M48 Patton was the most heavily armored vehicle in the United States Army, and the men in the tree line didn't care. 3 weeks later, the test came at scale. Lang Vei Special Forces Camp, 4 miles west of Khe Sanh. a cloverleaf perimeter of trenches and bunkers held by Detachment A-101, 5th Special Forces Group. 24 Americans, several hundred Bru tribesmen, a handful of Laotian refugees. Commanding officer, Captain Frank C. Willoughby. The North Vietnamese plan was simple. Send the 198th Tank Battalion across the Zepon River, about 6 miles of swimming and grinding, and crush the camp under armor and infantry. The Americans had been told tanks would never come this far south. They had been told the M72 Law rocket would handle anything that did. Both things were wrong. At 50 minutes past midnight on February 7th, Sergeant Nicholas Fragos in the Medical Observation Tower keyed his radio. "We have tanks in our wire." 11 Soviet PT-76 amphibious tanks rolled through the perimeter from 3 directions. RPG gunners and sappers behind them, satchel charges, thermite grenades, flamethrowers. Sergeant First Class James W. Holt manned the camp's 106mm recoilless rifle. He killed the first 3 tanks with 3 rounds. Then he ran for more ammunition. He was never seen alive again. His remains would not be identified for 47 years. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Shungle formed 2-man tank killer teams. He handed out M72 laws. The laws failed. Some misfired. Some were duds. Some bounced off. Some had been so hastily pushed from a hovering resupply helicopter that no one on site realized the law had a minimum arming distance of 33 feet. The tanks were already closer than that. One PT-76 was finally stopped only after the 5th direct hit. Shungle killed tank crewmen with his M16 as they bailed out of burning hulls. Within 13 minutes of the breakthrough, the perimeter collapsed. 8 Americans and roughly 30 South Vietnamese fell back to the command bunker. They held it for 8 hours. Sergeant First Class Eugene Ashley Jr., a Green Beret medic separated from the camp, organized a relief force out of the survivors of a nearby outpost. He led 5 assaults to reach the bunker. He called airstrikes almost on top of his own position. On the 5th charge, machine gun fire cut him down. An artillery shell killed him where he fell. He would receive the Medal of Honor. Of the 24 Americans inside Lang Vei when the tanks arrived, 14 escaped. Only 1 was unwounded. Lieutenant Paul Longrear, who survived the bunker, later described the night as a Wild West fight with Indians everywhere, and then a sentence that mattered more. Nobody considered the possibility of being overrun. The same week Lang Vei fell, the war's largest urban battle began, the imperial city of Hue, Tet, 1968. Marines of A Company, 3rd Tank Battalion, rolled their M48 Pattons into a city that had been engineered to swallow them. Spider holes at every intersection, sandbagged windows on every floor. Behind every wall, a man with a rocket. Captain Ron Christmas, who would receive the Navy Cross for his actions there, described what his Marines were walking into. Every soldier in a spider hole was armed with a rifle and an RPG launcher. A Marine tank commander named Corporal Mario Temez later said his platoon took more than 63 RPG and B-40 rocket hits during 9 days inside the Citadel walls. 63. The Patton's thick frontal armor absorbed most of them. The tanks kept fighting while their crews bled inside. But the lesson held. The volume of fire, the sheer number of men in spider holes with shape-charge rockets, meant every American tank in Hue was a magnet for a weapon that cost less than the radio its commander used to call for help. The wider war told the same story in the air. The United States deployed roughly 12,000 helicopters to Vietnam. The Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association documented 5,086 of them destroyed, 42% of the entire fleet. Most were brought down by small arms fire and heavy machine guns. The RPG-7, by comparison, was rare in the air-to-ground equation, but when it connected, it was unanswerable. Researchers studying the data estimate 128 helicopters were downed by RPG fire between 1967 and 1970, from roughly 380 recorded RPG versus helicopter engagements, roughly 1 shootdown for every 3 contacts. The horror was never the volume. The horror was the asymmetry. A passive, unguided rocket gave no warning, no radar lock, no flare to deploy, no countermeasure to fire. Nothing for the pilot to do. You only knew it was coming when you saw the smoke trail. By then, you were already inside the kill. In February of 1971, the South Vietnamese army crossed into Laos in an operation called Lam Son 719. 750 American helicopters supported them, about 160,000 sorties, 45 days of the heaviest ground fire of the entire war, 108 helicopters destroyed, about 618 damaged, 72 aircrew killed, 59 wounded, 11 missing. 10% of all American helicopter crew losses of the entire 15-year war happened in those 45 days. The air mobile doctrine, the idea that the Huey would deliver America's infantry to any battle, any time, at the moment of America's choosing, broke against the wall of small arms, anti-aircraft guns, and RPGs in those Laotian valleys. It would never fully recover. Let's be honest about the weapon. The RPG-7 had limits. Its grenade was slow, under 700 miles per hour. Crosswinds nudged it. Its smoke trail betrayed the gunner's position to the door gunner who would, 3 seconds later, return the fire that killed him. The warhead was a point-impact weapon, not a Hollywood fireball. The Australian Centurion tank's frontal armor often defeated it outright. Vietnam's own jungle canopy, the same canopy that hid the gunner, could detonate the warhead on a branch before it ever reached its target. Most American helicopters lost in Vietnam were lost to other weapons. This is what makes the fear of the RPG-7 interesting. It was not the deadliest weapon in Vietnam. It was the most disproportionate. The math of it, what one man in a tree line could do to what a superpower had spent 20 years and $20 billion building, was the math of the entire war, compressed into a single piece of hardware. The Americans had brought industrial firepower to a country of farmers. The farmers had been given a 4-foot tube that could destroy any of it. The RPG-7 did not stop with Vietnam. It went to Afghanistan in the 80s, where Soviet helicopters fell to a weapon Soviet factories had built. It went to Mogadishu in 1993, where Somali militiamen, having studied American helicopter patterns the way the NVA once did, used it to bring down 2 Blackhawks. It is in Ukraine right now. Over 9 million launchers have been manufactured. Roughly 40 nations field them. 9 countries still build them. The slat armor, the chain-link cages bolted to modern tanks to defeat shape-charge warheads, descends directly from the improvised wire bundles American crews welded onto their M113s in the wet jungle of 1968. 60 years after that first whoosh from a Vietnamese tree line, the same sound is still ending lives in a different war, on a different continent, against a different army. The weapon outlasted the empire that built it. It outlasted the empire it was built to fight. And the men who first heard it coming out of the jungle near Lang Vei would tell you, if you asked them, that they still hear it. Because some sounds you don't forget. Some sounds remind you what the actual price of a soldier turned out to be. About $300. And whatever was on the other end of the smoke trail.